It sounds like you did an amazing job and really put together a very, very extensive appeal on what is historically and traditionally a very difficult medical condition to convince an insurance company to say, hey, even though you met with 2 or 3 doctors and examined the claimant, because usually the companies don't even examine the claimant in the initial denial, and you were able to convince them that he is in fact disabled, and also gives a lot of hope to people that are watching this video or have been denied to say that, hey, Standard is a company that if you give them the support for your claim, that they will change their minds. Because a lot of people think it's over. And that's sad. You know, they call us and they're like, there's no way they're going to change their mind. And the reality is that we get them to change their mind often. Hi, I'm attorney Greg Dell, joined by attorney Stephen Jessup. And today we're going to discuss a recently resolved case against the Standard. And Stephen, in this video, we want you to tell us a little bit about why the claimant was denied, what you were able to do to get benefits reinstated, and then throughout our discussion, we'll offer some tips for people that have policies with the Standard that may help them to prevent themselves from getting denied in the future. So first, give us the background of this case.
Yeah, I think one thing to note that's important, this policy, because Standard does individual policies you can buy through an agent and employer-provided group disability policies. You know, the majority of policies in generally mean group, but this individual's were an individual disability policy. So he purchased that through an agent, paid all the premiums himself. It wasn't tied to his employment. And typically and historically, we usually see a less of an incidence of denial on individual disability claims as opposed to an employer provided. I think it has to do with the way that the law works in each one. But this was a situation for him. He had policy for years, filed the claim, and he did receive a denial. So prior to filing for disability, he was the managing director for a tax department for a company. So a very cognitively demanding job. He had had ongoing issues that really kind of started after a COVID infection in January of 2022, where it almost created or brought to life, if you will, various different conditions that were then later determined chronic fatigue syndrome. There was a diagnosis of fibromyalgia made. ADHD, sleep problems, insomnia, a myriad of issues going on. Continued to work with those to the best of his ability, but then it just kept getting progressively worse and worse and worse. So he decided he'd file a claim with Standard for benefits, and unfortunately, they denied his claim on the application, and then he hired us for the appeal. And I've always said, my personal experience in dealing with Standard, for the most part, I think they do thorough reviews. I don't think that they just try to do a very minimal review and deny a case. They really look into the file. And in this situation, they actually sent him to a 2-day independent medical examination with a neuropsychologist, because obviously in fatigue, he's saying, I can't physically do the work, but when I'm tired, I can't focus on the work. And, in our job, I always say it's shades of gray. We use words. We always have wiggle room. He's in tax. Numbers don't lie. They have to be exacting. So he was having more and more issues. So they did send him to a neuropsychological examination, which we'll kind of get to how we attack that later. But there was issues in it where they said questions about validity, effort, inconsistency, scoring that didn't seem to make sense. And then in conjunction with internal medical reviews to look at the physical, nature of the chronic fatigue, which in this situation, they actually questioned the diagnosis. Basically came to there's no evidence to support your subjective complaints. So a lot of things that we may see in an employer-provided policy, right, the attacking the subjectivity of the complaints, here I think they just did a little more legwork and at least having what could be deemed a rational or reasonable basis to have denied that claim.
So they relied on a neuropsychologist report, and then they also did other file reviews?
Did other file reviews, yeah. They had a rheumatologist and an internal medicine doctor look at the other physical conditions.
Okay, and as you said, Standard is they're not as big as, they're definitely not one of the top 7 or 8 largest disability insurance companies in the country, but they do historically do a deeper review and a better review of a claim on a denial than most of the other companies do, which makes it even more challenging for a claimant to get that denial reversed, which is why it's such a great outcome that you're able to do that in this case, especially when you have a medical condition that was basically based upon subjective complaints, which is not unusual because more than 90% of our claims deal with subjective complaints secondary to whatever the diagnosis was initially. And in this particular case, you have diagnoses that are all subjective, except COVID's not subjective because we know there was objective blood tests to show you have that. Now we're dealing with long COVID symptoms, which then exacerbated probably underlying conditions of fibromyalgia, like you said, chronic fatigue syndrome, as well as, other medical issues that develop. So you had a big challenge ahead of you going into this appeal. So what was your plan of attack and what did you do?
One of the first things, obviously, even though it was an individual policy, technically they didn't have to provide us a full copy of their file, right? As we know under the law, but they did. We requested it. They sent everything over, so we were able to get all the reviews and the reports. The first thing I always think about is how do we objectify subjective complaints? And even kind of going back to what you said, even if I have an MRI that shows herniated discs, I can point to a basis of pain, but the actual sensations of pain and what the person's reporting is all subjective. Insurance companies will argue, well, we don't think it should be that bad, right? So I had to first think about how do we provide objective evidence of it? One of the first things, at the simplest, most common denominator, because standard said, well, your job as a managing director of a tax department is sedentary. It's a desk job. And sedentary work and those concepts are all a construct of Department of Labor standards for physical work. Lawyers, we're sedentary job. So there's a defined of what that means. So I first figured the lowest hanging fruit is attacking that, the lowest common denominator. Can he do sedentary work? So we did set him up for a functional capacity examination. And, in discussing it with him, I told him, like, it is not going to replicate what you do in your day-to-day job in any way, shape, or form. It's going to test basic physical abilities in a workplace setting. And leading up to it, I said, one thing I don't want you to do is I don't want you to rest. I don't want you to take multiple days of rest knowing you have this exam, because we want an indication of what you would be, say, on a Thursday or Friday of a work week. If you've rested all weekend, you're good Monday, you pay for it later. So he underwent the testing. He had a very hard time getting through the testing. Even in the report itself from the examiner, and a lot of times you've read enough functional capacity examinations, they generally will just put out the facts, right? But in this one, he said that there was marked and, really large levels of fatigue that was supported by, biometric, heart rates and breathing and all that type of stuff, and came that they didn't believe he'd have the capacity for full-time sedentary work. So I have the argument physically he's not going to be able to do his job, but the biggest obstacle and hurdle was that neuropsych IME, in my opinion, and the attacking of that was along the idea in neuropsychological. The neuro aspect is, I think, the most important. That's often overlooked, especially by insurance companies, in that it's always searching for a neurological basis for the condition. He didn't have a neurological basis. So his profile is not going to match with any known neurological condition. But the reviewing doctor was trying to make his chronic fatigue syndrome somehow make sense in a perspective of a neurological condition. So we attack that, the validity or inconsistency. We provided, reports and research that show that in this diagnosis, you would expect to see these types of things. Also, the neuropsychologist said, there was no indication in his medical records of ADHD or ADD, but he's showing markers of this and that and that. Well, that was in his records, right? So we were able to kind of undermine the opinion of the neuropsychologist a bit, which helped. And then we did what was known as a cognitive functional assessment, which is kind of more of an a la carte cognitive testing. And that's geared more towards, in letting that doctor know, hey, here's what the medical conditions are. And the doctor then selects, we're going to do these types of tests because these are probably the ones that are going to be most related to any restrictions or limitations he may have on account of it. And that testing did show, right, certain issues with focus and concentration. But we're still in a situation where it's going to be kind of hard to go. And, then also having to attack the peer reviews. That doctor called into the diagnosis of chronic fatigue as actually being supported by the clinical evidence. And that's unusual in the sense more often than not, the insurance company will give you the condition, say, all right, you have it. We don't think it's that bad. But in the appeal, we pointed out what the CDC had to say, like what the criteria to meet, and then showed how in the records our client met all that criteria. And thankfully, I think it's probably in part the client lives in Idaho. The doctor up there did not take kindly to having his opinion kind of like ripped apart, if you will. And the doctor was very, very supportive in filling out, the treating doctor filling out forms and writing statements for us. So we just try to build up as much objective evidence and then tie it back into really what the nature of the disability policy means. can you do your job? We proved activities of daily living are problematic, but even if he could do those, could he do those very mentally demanding, job duties as a tax person?
It sounds like you did an amazing job and really put together a very, very extensive appeal on what is historically and traditionally a very difficult medical condition to convince an insurance company to say, hey, even though you met with 2 or 3 doctors and examined the claimant, because usually the companies don't even examine the claimant in the initial denial, and you were able to convince them that he is in fact disabled, and also gives a lot of hope to people that are watching this video or have been denied to say that, hey, Standard is a company that if you give them the support for your claim, that they will change their minds. Because a lot of people think it's over. And that's sad. They call us and they're like, there's no way they're going to change their mind. And the reality is that we get them to change their mind often. And benefits get reinstated. Claimant goes back to getting their benefits. They'll get a back check payment going up until the date in which benefits are reinstated. And then they'll move forward on claims subject to the same reviews that they were before. Obviously, they'll have you to represent the client to make sure that and give the client the best opportunity that this doesn't happen again by continuing to update the medical records, helping with the claimant statement, helping with the attending physician statement, being present on interviews if Standard wants to speak to the claimant, and really just advocating for the client and advising the client as to everything that he should be doing to prevent a denial in the future. So congratulations on this victory, and I'm sure the client was absolutely thrilled. If you're someone out there who has a Standard short or long-term disability insurance claim, feel free to reach out to Stephen, myself, any of our lawyers. We always provide initial free phone consultation, and no matter where you live in the country, we're available to assist you.